Good morning and welcome to this latest webinar from Visit Scotland, just days away from the widespread reopening of tourism in Scotland. With me is Malcolm Roughead, who's the Chief Executive of Visit Scotland, and he's going to bring you right up to date on what the organisation has been doing across the board in tourism. I'm Bill McFarlane, I'm the Chairman of Pink Elephant Communications. Well, good morning, Malcolm, how are you?
Very well, thank you, Bill, and good morning to everyone. Hope everybody's feeling well on this sunny morning.
Well, I'm sure people are generally feeling more optimistic, Malcolm, than in the early days when we were doing these calls, when it was unclear what was going to happen. Before we go through some of the detail as to what you've been doing, can you give me a sense of the sentiment that you're experiencing across tourism right now?
I think it would be fair to say that the mood is very different from, say, 16 weeks ago. I've been speaking to numerous groups, doing various webinars, virtually, obviously, across the country. And there is a sense of nervousness because we're about to go into a new norm, whatever that's going to look like as it progresses. But there's a sense of purpose, there's a positivity that's around the place. And I think people just want to get on with it now and get moving. I'd probably say that, 16 weeks ago, there was kind of no light at the end of a very dark tunnel. And now for many sectors, and not all of them, we need to remember, are able to open up at once. For some in the events industry in particular, there's a sense of frustration. And also within that supply chain, there's obviously some concern because a lot of them are micro businesses, whether they'll even survive. So it varies, but I think for those that are able to open up, there is definitely a mood of positivity and a real sense of hope that's beginning to creep in now, which is great. So
you've been busy in the background all the time, Malcolm. Tell me what you've been doing personally and as an organisation to get as much ready as quickly as you can to make this reopening as successful as you can.
Yeah, we took a fairly structured approach to this. Obviously, you'll be aware of the Scottish Government's 4 phases from respond through to recovery with reset and restart in between. And like all good things, Bill, it never goes sequentially. There's, still bits at respond. There's other bits that are at the recovery, but it allows you to shape what it is that you're trying to do. And we had 7 areas of focus within Visit Scotland. One was obviously marketing, albeit not in the sense of trying to get people to convert at this particular moment in time. It was very much about staying top of mind. And the overarching message was, sort of dream now, travel later. But it was certainly to keep Scotland out there. The other aspect was business advice and signposting. So we had over 4,000 calls to individual businesses. And in the initial period, it was very much about hearing what the issues were, what the challenges were, and being able to aggregate that and feed it back in to ministers and Scottish Government to help them with their decision making. And that complemented the work that Scottish Tourism Alliance was doing at the same time. So I think, that just added volume to what we were all saying. And now, obviously, in certain areas, as we're reopening, what we're now doing is looking at helping businesses, get their listings sorted, up to date, and telling them about the various business opportunities that exist. We also had a program where we just called it Stay in Touch, which is with our partners and customers overseas. So on a constant basis, every week, we touch base with agents and operators and airlines, etc., from China all the way through to North America, Australia, and into Europe. And again, it was very much about touching base with them, making sure that they were aware of where Scotland was in terms of opening. But more recently, it's much more product focused. It's looking at what are they going to be doing in terms of selling Scotland and their programs. And we've been doing online training with them as well, just to bring their own staff up to date with what's going on in Scotland. At the same time, we reconvened the Scottish Tourism Emergency Response Group, which is made up of representatives from the various enterprise agencies, Skills Development Scotland, COSLA, and the Scottish Tourism Alliance. And the whole purpose of that was to look at pulling together all the various activities that needed to be implemented so that we have a cohesive action plan as we emerge out of this, and we avoid duplication and overlap. The STERG, as it's called, was actually first formed way back in 2001 when we had foot and mouth. So it has been convened on a few occasions, and that's helped actually, because there was, a precedence for us all getting together and actually being able to work through these particular crises. The other area that actually we came across, it was quite interesting, in the events industry side. There are many sort of regional groups, but there's actually no overarching voice for the events industry. So we held a number of fora, about 25 across the country. And again, we were looking at what are the issues that the events industry is facing at the moment, and how could we pull that together. And that led to the Events Industry Advisory Group being set up, and that's chaired by Peter Duthie from the SEC in Glasgow. And that's allowed us to identify the issues that the events industry and the supply chain are still facing, and feed that into ministers. And what we're looking for is some action coming out of that as well. Clearly, research and horizon scanning is very important, and we've been doing that consistently, looking at consumer sentiment, looking at community sentiment, but also learning from what other markets are doing, and taking best practice, or trying to take best practice from all the various countries around the world, looking at how they've managed to come out of it in certain cases like New Zealand, or others like in Europe where perhaps they're not quite ready to do that. So we've been able to exchange the knowledge that we gleaned over the last sort of 4 months with them. And then clearly there's my own Visit Scotland organisation, got 650 people that I have a duty of care for, and we've gone from lockdown within a week to now looking at, what will the world look like when we start to move back into potentially move back into offices. Could be a hybrid, we don't know, but also looking at the information centres, getting them back into operation. And then you come up against the sort of logistics, in terms of actually finding cleaners. And, we have to go through things like testing for Legionella, etc. So, we've got the day job as much as all the extra bits on top of it.
The sense you get, Malcolm, is that people can be overwhelmed with everything extra that they have to do as well. And for all the support packages that are available, and I know there are many of them, are you concerned that some people in tourism will still fall between the cracks here?
Yes, and that's one of the reasons why our industry relationship managers have been keeping in touch with businesses. It's to make sure that they can navigate their way through a very comprehensive but sometimes confusing landscape of packages. And certainly, as I mentioned earlier, Bill, the challenge for us at the moment is trying to help the events industry and the supply chain within that, because there are many micro businesses that make up that supply chain. And one fact that was surprising to me, I didn't know it, was just even the Hogmanay Festival has 500 small suppliers.
So that's so wide-ranging. I mean, it must be everybody in the supply chain is affected there. And of course, it'll be a long time before we know what the knock-on effect is on this. Well, how confident would you say Scottish tourism is right now in terms of opening its doors across the board on July 15th?
Well, the totality of Scottish tourism takes in many things, which is why we call it the visitor economy. So only elements of that can open, obviously accommodation, etc. But the events industry, business events, sporting events, cultural events will have to wait a little while. We don't have a date for that. We've got the aviation industry, which is slowly coming back. And yesterday, you know, with the 57 countries that were announced, that helps us in terms of looking at some of the European markets. But again, long haul is going to take a bit longer. So it's not everybody that's opening on the 15th, and we need to remember that.
And of course, the announcement from the Scottish government about Spain being on the quarantine list, well, that's disappointing for people who were thinking of going to Spain. Does it in any way help Scottish tourism that more people may go for the staycation as a result?
To be honest with you, Bill, I mean, I think the issue of quarantine is one that's a very delicate subject, obviously, and it could easily happen here. So, you know, we have to follow the path that we're on, take the advice and the guidance that we have. I was more encouraged by the fact that France and Germany and some of the other European markets, which are absolutely key to the European numbers, that they're fine. And you know, we have meetings coming up with the likes of Lufthansa and SAS and obviously EasyJet and others that fly into those markets. So that actually was very encouraging.
Okay, now what about the island communities? Because so many of them have, if you like, been protected by coronavirus. There must be a sense of nervousness there about people wanting away from it all, wanting peace and quiet and wanting safety in the UK and heading to the islands, which have been safe. What sense do you get from the communities themselves?
Again, it's kind of mixed. There's a kind of polarity there in terms of, you're absolutely right, communities want to be safe, but they do understand the importance of tourism to their local economy. Because if there wasn't tourism in some of these communities, then, you know, there'd be no jobs, and then you start to look at potential impact on population sizes. So it has to be done in harmony and at a pace that communities are comfortable with. And at the moment, in fact, actually after this session, I have a webinar with the people in Argyll just to talk about that very subject. And what you are seeing is a lot of the regional groups are coming out with their own visitor charters, they're coming out with their own customer promise, which is about responsible tourism. It's looking after the natural assets, it's working with communities in tandem to make sure that the local amenities are in place and that they're not overwhelmed. I mean, it's totally understandable, the sentiment that is there, but we have to actually move together forward, because without the communities, there is no tourism.
Well, I was in St Andrews on Saturday afternoon trying to find a dry place in Scotland, and also enjoying going more than 5 miles from my home, Malcolm. And what I got a sense of was that everybody, the shopkeepers, the coffee shops, were taking this very seriously, and there was a natural sense of caution from people. So do you believe these two things combined will allow us to take these first steps into a more reassured economy?
Yeah, so it's interesting you were in St Andrews, because that was one of the groups I was speaking to last week, and it was very much about working hand in hand, making sure that the visibility of the precautions is there, which is reassuring, and it's reassuring for the community, but it's also reassuring for visitors, because just as much as communities want to feel safe, so do visitors, and they want to know that you know, the guidelines and the protocols are being followed. And that's where actually the Good to Go project came to fruition, just launched over a week or so ago, which is a mark which allows you to, as a business, to demonstrate to visitors that you are following the appropriate guidelines and protocols. And the take-up of that it has been quite phenomenal. I mean, it's touching 4,000 businesses have signed up to that now in just over a week.
And do you believe everybody really understands all the criteria? I see one question is asking about transparent face masks. So, I mean, do you believe there's enough clarity about exactly what restaurateurs, hoteliers have to do?
I think the guidelines, and they are guidelines, you know, and protocols, and they've all been pulled together by the various trade bodies. You know, so UK Hospitality played a major role in pulling some of this together. The Association of Scottish Visitor Attractions, Association of Scottish Self-Caterers. So, you know, it's not that we've sat in a dark room and dreamt these up. I mean, these are actually from the industry, for the industry, and it's very much about interpretation. And if you look at them, I think I've read them, and I'm not a hotelier, and I get, you know, what it is that you're meant to be doing. And there's a kind of baseline. Now, if you want to go above and beyond that, that's fine. But if you follow the guidelines and the protocols, that'll be fine. And then likewise, you have the Retail Consortium has contributed to retail guidelines. And I think we're all familiar, having, you know, gone to the shops to see exactly what that can look like.
I noticed another question saying, what is the best way to reassure customers just now? I mean, is it to be proactive and to say, we followed all the best advice, we are making it as safe as possible? What would you say to them?
We know from the research that people are looking for that reassurance that the guidelines and protocols are actually being followed. So I would certainly major in on the fact that, you know, we've done that. It is safe to come here. You'll be well looked after. You'll be welcome. And then eventually that will become a hygiene factor. It'll be the norm.
Well, yesterday, another first, my wife and I had a spot of lunch out at an outside cafe in our area. And she'd been very reluctant even to go back somewhere. Why would you want to be served with people wearing face masks, was what she said, when that would suggest that there's a danger? And the funny thing was, when I asked her how her experience was afterwards, she said, reassuring. So I think the nervousness, Malcolm, is about the unknown. Yes. But when people see the measures in place, that will give them reassurance.
Well, that's right. And you know, again, if you look at face masks, that's quite an alien you know, topic for us in the UK, but in Europe, or particularly in the Far East, it's, you know, very much the norm. And I think the more that we get used to being out of our comfort zone, then, you know, the readier we are to accept the differences that we're going to face, because we can't go back to the way it was. So we need to accept the way it's going to be. But to do that, there's a familiarity that needs to creep in with it.
Now, Vicky Miller, a couple of weeks ago, gave us a very extensive walk through the marketing plan, because it's changed, obviously, so dramatically. Can you give us a summary of where you are with marketing in terms of what you're hoping for just now in terms of response to that, and what the longer term plan is?
Yeah, if anyone wants actual details, they can get it on VisitScotland.org. But just to give you a brief synopsis, as I said, we started off very much about trying to keep Scotland top of mind. And that was very, sort of making sure that we were messaging along the lines of Dream Now, Travel Later. That then moved into when we were able to get out and about for your 5-mile radius, to sort of stay local and support your local community. So we've seen great examples of that with local suppliers, you know, sort of doing particularly well in the food and retail side. And then now where we're getting to, it's very much about the UK staycation market, Scotland, big focus on that as well, which we'll see next week. And that's about traveling locally, but making a big difference to local communities to help kickstart the economy in those areas. Meanwhile, at the same time, now that the markets in Europe and elsewhere that have no quarantine restrictions, we can start to ramp up our activity in those areas. But for some of the other markets, that'll take a little bit longer, because if you look at North America, clearly we can't get in or out there, and that's a major market in international terms for us. But the activity will start next week, and I hope everybody will be inspired by it when you see it.
Now, self-catering has been ahead of the curve in many ways here, Malcolm. It's been open for several days. What have you been hearing from the self-catering sector as to how it's gone for them and what the numbers have looked like?
Yeah, the feedback by and large has been pretty positive. What we've seen in a number of areas, particularly those rural areas, is that bookings have been very strong. Forward bookings are looking very good. And that would reflect the consumer research that we're getting as well at the moment. Self-contained accommodation is sought after at the moment. Again, with that group we were talking about, the various groups, not just St Andrews, but the people who are self-caterers and who were on that group were reporting very strong bookings.
And will their season extend? I mean, are they looking to take it into November, for example, when previously they'd have stopped in October?
Yes, I think that's an interesting question, and it's obviously down to the individual and whether they can or want to. Again, looking at the research that we're picking up from the visitor intent is to look at October through to December. So I think what we're seeing is people have postponed holidays, and they're just going to take them a little bit later on in the year. Now we'll see whether that's still the case as people start travelling around the country, and we're running this research on a weekly basis. So we should be able to get pretty much real-time data coming through that will allow us to inform businesses as to demand going forward.
I see an interesting question coming through there about any guidance for those fly drive visitors from England. It's difficult for them to return home without using public transport. So, I mean, I suppose because we're all at different stages here, do you have any clear guidance to the English market as to how and what they can do once in Scotland?
Yeah, what we have is we have the ability to allow businesses to post on their listing on VisitScotland.com what's open or what's not going to be open. So the advice that we give to everybody is know before you go. So don't just turn up and hope that things are going to be open, because for various reasons, some things won't be. So be well advised in advance what you can and what you can't do. Be well advised of the guidelines and the protocols. And I think there's a responsibility, there's an individual responsibility as tourists that we need to take as well. We need to inform ourselves. We can't just sort of turn up and expect everything to be as it was. So I think in terms of public transport, there is, I think there's some dubiety at the moment about whether it's going to be 2 meters or 1 meter. It's definitely not helpful if 2 meters in one place and 1 meter in another. And then you get into the whole scenario, not just with trains, etc., but also with ferries. You could have the Stena line coming from Ireland, which is 2 meters, 1 meter, and then coming into Cairnryan at 2 meters. So how does the ferry operator manage its way around that? So there's still some guidelines and protocols that need to be ironed out here.
So I appreciate this is a massive communication issue for the government of Westminster, for the government at Holyrood, for two countries that are slightly out of step with each other. And to me, the Scottish Government advice has been as clear as it can be, yet it's complicated. And I do see a couple of questions saying, okay, so what happens when somebody gets sick in our accommodation? Where does responsibility begin and end? Have you got a clear answer on that?
That question's come up quite a lot, actually, and we've fed that back into the Scottish Government, asking for a bit more clarity around it. And I believe that the guidelines have been updated. So I would suggest, the first protocol is actually to go to the guidelines on the Scottish Government's own website.
And I believe that's what Barbara Clark is just indicating to you, and she sent a link which is on the web chat there. Okay, now I watched the Chancellor's statement yesterday about half-price meals Monday to Wednesday, and my first question was, does this apply in Scotland? Is there any clarity on that, Malcolm?
Well, I think the standard answer to that is we're still waiting on details coming out from it, but if it does, I'll certainly be applying, Bill.
Yeah, so me too. I'll be joining the queue 2 meters apart. Now, just to be clear here, tourism is a devolved matter, but the Exchequer is a nationwide matter. And I suppose it really comes down to whether this is a direct thing like VAT, where the connection is between the tourist outlet and the Treasury. But I take it you'll publish on VisitScotland.org any clarity on that as soon as you get it.
Yes, we will do, absolutely.
Okay. What about the VAT situation? Is that a welcome boost for tourism?
Yes, the initial response has been positive. It's something that the industry in general has been pushing for quite some time now. It'll be interesting. I think the interesting aspect to this is, will it stimulate and kickstart the economy? And if it does, then does that strengthen the case for it to be extended? Because it is only for 6 months at the moment.
And of course, the trouble is that the Chancellor's got to claw money back to pay for the billions that are going out the other side. So that's the balance for the Treasury. Well, you're speaking regularly to the Tourism Secretary, Fergus Ewing. What sense are you getting from him about his confidence that Scottish tourism will begin to start to claw back its position from July the 15th?
I think he's very positive. I mean, he really gets the issues that the industry is facing, and he's had many conversations with groupings, talks to the Scottish Tourism Alliance Council on a weekly basis. I know he's had meetings with the holiday parks and Caravan Club and UK Hospitality and various other groups. So he's very aware of the issues, and he's very proactive in trying to address those particular issues, because he believes in the tourism economy. You can see the importance of it to the Scottish economy as a whole. I think if you were to ask him, he's probably a lot more positive now than perhaps sort of many months. It feels like many months ago. But then I think that is just in keeping with the rest of us. So you're watching other countries. You mentioned that earlier on. Is there any country that you're seeing that seems to be getting the balance just right with tourism in the very early weeks of this unlocking? Well, there's lots of great practice. But the one thing you can't do is just replicate what another country is doing, because the circumstances are all very different. So I think it is looking at, in fact, actually, I'll give you a good example, a country I do know quite well, which is New Zealand, just because I have a large extended family out there. And they've been in lockdown. No one can get in or out of the country. And now there is a call in New Zealand to open up the borders and particularly have an air bridge with Australia. And they're resisting that at the moment because they're still saying the time is not right. So they've taken a very cautious approach and gone very much for the domestic market, which was never a big thing in terms of its overall tourism size. Then you look at places like Amsterdam, which came out with, they look like sort of garden, sort of glass houses, where people could actually sit outside by the river. And, you know, so you think, well, that's quite interesting. That's a different way of addressing particular issues. You've got places like France, which has got a voucher scheme, albeit that's based on your earnings. So there are different things that markets are trying to do. But in broad terms, they're all focusing on the domestic market first, and then the near markets, and then the long haul markets. There's no variance whatsoever.
What I'm seeing, Malcolm, and I was borne out at the restaurant we visited yesterday, is that where people are willing and financially able to put lots of measures in, then they're able to mitigate against, if you like, some of the downside of the restrictions. So the restaurateur was saying, I'm putting in perspex sheeting between the booths, which are all back to back. Otherwise, I'd have to leave every second one empty, and that's unviable. So how much are you encouraging people to do the maximum they can to get the maximum revenue back again?
Well, again, that comes back down to what is best practice and learning from the various peer groups. Because, as you rightly say, as I said earlier, you can't just replicate things because every place is different. It depends on the logistics. It depends on the dimensions. I've been speaking to some places where effectively it's not worth them opening up because they just don't have enough covers, whereas others are able to operate at 40% capacity. Some with different configurations can get up to 70% capacity. So I think the answer is an individual answer, and it really is dependent on circumstances. And what we can bring the knowledge that we glean from talking to industry and say, look, here is a potential solution for you, but it may not be the right one, but there are others. So it's bringing that information together, putting it into an easy to access place, and then really it's down to the individual establishment to decide what's the right thing for it.
I sense some nervousness from one or two of the comments about people who are worried about being left with the responsibility of somebody who does become ill. Would the guest then have to pay for the extra week or 2 weeks room or self-catering accommodation? Where does the responsibility begin and end? Now, we touched on that a little earlier, but is there anywhere where there's absolute clarity in all that?
Again, I think I would have to refer you back to the new updated guidelines, because that's, you know, again, an issue that has been raised on a number of occasions.
And again, I think Barbara Clark's saying we're going to get some clarity from the Scottish Government on that. It's one of these grey areas. I saw an earlier comment about minibuses for 9 people, larger buses. Tour operators are clearly worried, Malcolm, and they are one of the groups who are going to be most severely affected by this. What are you saying to them, and what have you been able to offer them in terms of advice?
Well, again, that's what we need there is you know, decisions around the social distancing, because at 2 meters, that's a very different prospect from 1 meter. I have seen a number of coaches where you've got 2 seats on one side, but one of them's taped off to allow for that. And again, I think it comes down to what are the precautionary measures we can take to make it safe for people to travel. And if we get down to, I don't know if this will happen or not, I'm only surmising, but if we get down to obligatory face masks and 1 meter, then that suddenly increases the capacity and the capability of that particular business to operate profitably.
I see a question there, Malcolm, about shared entrances for self-catering. Now, I've visited people who hired a place in the centre of Edinburgh before, communal entrance, but individual apartments within that. Does Visit Scotland have a position on that? Because the question is, well, is that due to reopen on the 15th of July? I believe it is. Some people are advocating that should wait until September. What's your view?
Well, let's put it this way. If I live in a tenement, what's the difference?
Yeah, so it's the same for people who are just having to cohabit beside each other. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the rules therefore allow July 15th for opening? Is that simply the argument you'd put back to those who are saying it's too early?
Yes, I think actually it's a different argument. I think it's not about the safety, because as I say, I mean, how do you apply that across people who live permanently in these premises? I think it's back to the pre-COVID arguments around the likes of short-term lets.
Now, you're talking about the events industry and how there was a need for representation across the board there, and how Peter Duthie of SEC is on board with that. Are you getting a sense as to what's going to be possible next year? I mean, the Coast and Waters year has been put back to 2021. Do you believe that most things will be able to operate normally as such next year with restrictions in place?
Yes, I mean, I think there's an underlying strength in the events industry and in the business events in particular. Scotland punches way above its weight, and what the reports we're getting are that the out years are looking very strong. So one has to assume that by then everything will be in place, will be up and running. We've got obviously world-class venues in Aberdeen, the SEC, which is obviously going to be a hospital for a while still. But the new arena up in Aberdeen and also the EICC in Edinburgh are world-class. So I think once we get up and going, but of course we need clarification there as well, because we don't actually know, what the size of audience is going to be. Will it be gradually increased from, I've heard, between 50 and 100. Some countries it's 500. In Austria it's over 1,000. So there's still a lot of decisions to be taken yet around that particular area. And likewise for sporting and cultural events, obviously there's a lot of conversations going on with various representative bodies about, take football, will that be played behind closed doors to begin with, and then gradually, you start to open up? Will there be social distancing, measures put in place? So there's still a lot of decisions to be taken yet.
It's interesting. I've had tickets for a few concerts. Elton John, for example, simply put the dates back to November 2021. But I'm thinking, what really are we going to see 12,000 plus people watching Elton John in the Hydro? I mean, do you believe that's possible?
I'm probably not the right person to ask. I think that is a question for Peter Duthie. I would imagine that whether those capacities are going to be viable or not, I'm not sure. Currently, as we look at it, I would think not. You want to go to somewhere like Stennismuir, Bill, social distancing is a fact of life.
There's many Scottish football clubs actually have got built-in social distancing. It's called a low attendance. Okay, now back to the events of the 15th of July now. What do you believe is the best case scenario in the first couple of weeks? What are you expecting to see, and what are you hoping to see across the board in Scottish tourism in that period?
I'm expecting to see a gradual reopening, a gradual return of confidence. I think people will get used to the new way of working, but it will take time. And as that confidence grows, I think you then start to build a little bit of momentum. And then as long as we can get everything aligned and clarity around some of the points that have been raised today as well, and that reassurance for communities and also for visitors and business. So working together, I think we'll take small steps, and then gradually I think the pace will quicken.
England certainly experienced with Leicester being locked down for a couple of weeks. Scotland had Dumfries really for a few days. Is that localization the way forward as you see it, in terms of allowing people to do what they want to do, to get back to business, to get the economy going again, but to be able to have to put out a fire locally if it breaks out?
That seems to be the accepted norm, and that's not just here in the UK. That's elsewhere, and I think the guidance seems to be around that we can expect, the odd occasion like that. But it's about, for me, it's about decisive action. Sort of making sure that you act quickly, you stifle it, and then you can move on. And we saw that in Dumfries and Galloway. I mean, they locked it down very quickly in those postcodes, and then now, obviously, they're able to re-emerge pretty quickly from it.
Have you been able to estimate from the people you're speaking to which areas in Scotland seem to be coming back most quickly in terms of what their bookings for the 15th of July are showing?
Well, we do have that data, and what, in terms of demand, put it that way, as opposed to conversion, because we don't know who's actually converting, but we can see where the demand is for. And at the moment, rural areas, as I said, huge demand for that, for the islands as well. And I think with cities, as more things begin to open up, what you'll see is demand beginning to re-emerge there.
And what do you expect in terms of the length of the tourism season across the board? I mean, are you expecting the autumn visit to become, if you like, what was going to be our summer, just delayed by 3 months?
Well, we've always said Scotland's a year-round destination. So I think, given just where we are, we've missed a number of months. So it's almost like a rephasing, if you like. And we know that a lot of people postponed coming to Scotland. They didn't cancel it. So the demand is still there. It might be helpful if we got another school holiday or two, so allow a few more short breaks, stimulate that. But no, I'm pretty confident that we will get back to a year-round proposition very quickly.
And in terms of that international visit, clearly the European countries are all at slightly different stages. America, we know, it's almost on its own in terms of people in and people out. What do you believe is the likely timescale to be able to see the international visitors come back again?
Well, we're already seeing demand, not at the same level, obviously, because a lot of that is about availability of aircraft. It's also about capacity and frequency. But there is demand, particularly from Europe and the States. States, obviously, we can't do much about at the moment, but we can convert that European demand. And that's one of the key areas that we'll be looking at as from next week.
So the scenes to me from Glasgow and Edinburgh Airport are quite shocking, of the empty concourses, but that's really because we've been unable to go anywhere. I take it these planes, often who've been depositing Scots in France and Germany and Spain, you're expecting a number of French, German, Spaniards to be coming back in again. Well, Spaniards, that's a different issue just now for the Scottish government, but certainly France and Germany and other European countries. That's
right, absolutely right. And the aviation industry also has to, get its supply chain in place. We need to get aircraft into the right areas. They need to bring back their crew, and also they have their own guidelines and protocols in terms of looking after their passengers. So again, I think, as I mentioned earlier, we have ongoing conversations with the airlines, looking at how we can work with them together to stimulate that demand and then fulfill it. And we have very close relationships with the likes of EasyJet. And next week, we've got conversations coming up with SAS, so Finnair and Lufthansa. So it's beginning to move forwards and move forward in the right direction.
So Malcolm, what would your overall message be then as people look forward to July 15th? What would you urge them to do, and what do you believe they can do to maximize revenue while maximizing safety?
Well, I think the first thing is, stay safe, follow the guidelines, follow the protocols. look at the Good to Go scheme, utilise that, because that is an outward manifestation of the fact, to visitors, and giving them confidence that you followed the guidelines and protocols. Be positive, be welcoming, be yourselves, and I think just get on board with all the various activities and platforms that are there to maximise your presence and your availability.
And I see a comment from a tour operator saying it's difficult to plan ahead without being absolutely certain what's open. Would you urge all tourism outlets to let you know, to let everybody know that they are open for business, so tour operators, for example, can plan that out?
And they can do that. You can do that by updating your own listing on VisitScotland.com. For those who are not on it, it's free of charge. Just get in touch. It's easy to do. And we have over 22 million regular users of VisitScotland.com. So when they are looking to go to a particular place, they will be able to see what is open and what is not open. And in terms of tour operators, our trade team is there, more than happy to touch base, and we'll give them guidance on how to reach the various markets.
Well, Malcolm, I'm certainly looking forward to getting out and about on Scotland's roads this summer. I'll be staying in this country. I'll be spending money in restaurants, whether it's a discounted meal. I'll enjoy the VAT relief, and I'll go to some of my favourite haunts, and I trust everybody does the same and gets the Scottish economy going again. Thank you very much indeed for your time this morning. Good luck with all the work. I know there's been a huge amount of extra work over the last few months, and there's a lot of work to come. But I sense from what you're saying that you're optimistic that we can claw back a lot from this season by just going about it the right way.
Absolutely right. And it's a resilient sector, and there's some amazing people in it, Bill, and I'm sure we'll get back on our feet very, very quickly.
Certainly proved that in the past with foot and mouth and other issues. So we look forward to doing that again. Malcolm Roughead, thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you, and to everyone else.